Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to A House Divided, coming to you from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. My name is Bjorn Skaptason, and I am the administrator of today's program. Boy, it seems like just 24 hours we were all here together, and we were talking with Dr. Karen Cox about Confederate monuments and all of that controversy. But now we are back with Ed Steers, the author of Getting Right with Lincoln, Correcting Misconceptions About Our Greatest President. And you'll meet Ed Steers in just a moment. But before that time, I want to let you know you're watching this on Facebook Live. And so I am going to put a link to the order page for this book into the comments section, because that will give you a chance to order a signed first edition copy of Getting Right with Lincoln, signed on a custom book plate. This is the release date of Getting Right with Lincoln, and so we will call this a book drop party. I think that would be appropriate. Do ask us questions. We want to answer your questions about Getting Right with Lincoln, and you can ask those questions in the comments section of this live stream. I'll come back in about 30 minutes into the program, let's say about 4 o'clock Central Time, 5 o'clock Eastern Time. And if you have asked some questions then I'll share them with Ed Steers. But between now and then to the end, we are going to watch a conversation between your host, Daniel Weinberg, and Ed Steers. So with that in mind, I am going to step aside and hand things over to your host for the day, Daniel Weinberg of Abraham Lincoln Bookshop.
Thank you, Bjorn. And I am Daniel Weinberg in the broadcast studio of Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, and with our show, A House Divided, which we've been doing under a couple of other names since 2005. So now everyone is caught up with us with Zoom, but we were the only ones doing it for an awfully long time. But we still are here, and we also sell books, which most others don't, directly. And so we're happy to be here today. And you're on Facebook, so don't forget to like us, comment, and share us as well. And as Bjorn said, please do. I forgot what I was going to say about it. I thought about the next question. So whatever I was going to say, I'll, with telepathy, get it to you. So let's go with our author today, Ed Steers, Jr. Many of you know who he is. In 1963, he was trained as a molecular biologist, though, and until 1984, I put 18 here, was on staff at National Institute of Health, and then director of Diabetes and Digestive Disease and Kidney Disease Institute. He retired in 1994 to do full-time writing, thankfully, because we have wonderful books that he's done. He's appeared on Book Notes, C-SPAN's Book TV, PBS, and even the Today Show. And he's the author of numerous articles in magazines and newspapers. Books that he's authored include Blood on the Moon, The Assassination of Abraham Lincoln, Lincoln Legends, Myths, Hoax, and Confabulations, the Lincoln Assassination Encyclopedia, which I use all the time, His Name is Still Mud, and many more. So today's latest book, which is, as Bjorn said, this is the release date, and it's Getting Right with Lincoln, Correcting Misconceptions About Our Greatest President, from the University Press of Kentucky. There it is. It's 198 pages and illustrated, and it's $27.95. And here is the back of it. And just quickly, who designed this wonderful jacket? I really like it. Ed, who designed that?
I don't know. I had submitted a different design, which I thought was quite catchy. And they countered with this, which I thought was wonderful. I thought, you know, as you well know, the dust jacket, you want people to go pick up the book. That's the first thing you want them to do. And it's the dust jacket that I think makes people pick up a book. So
Very true. Maybe your design can go to the second edition.
the revised edition, yes. Well, in that edition, Abraham Lincoln is wearing sunglasses. So I thought,
All right.
I thought that was catchy. Yes, no, but he did a wonderful job.
Yeah, it's a beautiful jacket.
It is.
So this is the release date, as we said, and anyone who purchases the book today will get a special day of release signed book plate. Ed signed these for us. Usually we have them signed here in the shop, but we can't do that yet because of COVID. But this is a book plate that you can get if you get it today. And it's almost like you can get a limited edition, just those today. If you're watching this broadcast later on YouTube, you'll be able to get a signed book plate as well, just not the day of release. So, I was going to just go through very quickly, not read all of them because we're going to get to questions about everything, but just to let people know about what's in this book. Chapters are including the shiftless father myth. I think we all know who that is. The case of identity theft. We're talking about the Bixby letter. And Rutledge will be talked about. We talked about Lincoln's relationship with the Native Americans. There's one called the Reluctant Emancipator. The Ailing Lincoln, you know about Marfan's, we'll talk about that. And a couple of other subjects that are also in the book. So let's begin with, first of all, maybe what's not in the book, strangely enough. Lincoln felt that certain measures during the Civil War were expedient, and habeas corpus was one of those. How did you compile what misconception topics you're going to put in the book? Because certainly habeas corpus could have been in there, perhaps. What others maybe were left out? Perhaps religion, spurious Lincoln quotes. How did you decide what was going to go in?
Well, I had written Lincoln Legends, which seemingly would cover some of these topics, but not really. For instance, Thomas Lincoln. And in Lincoln Legends, that talked about who was the father of Abraham Lincoln. But what stimulated me to write this book, I guess the best word would be frustration. I mean, I watch book notes on C-SPAN every weekend. And as you know, there's a fair amount of Lincoln that appears on those 48 hours. And in a recent documentary by CNN, that six-part series, I'm troubled by what I hear and what I see. And to give you an example, the CNN series is a good example because that's a 6-hour, 6-part series, and yet only 16 minutes were devoted to the first 28 years of Lincoln's life. And if you go through all the major biographies, I'm talking about the more recent modern biographies of Lincoln, it's the same story. You'll find only maybe 4, 5, 6 pages will be devoted to those early years of Lincoln, as if they really don't matter much. And yet, having been raised as a microbial geneticist, I know that, those first years are what make the man. And if you really want to understand how Lincoln thought and worked, I think you have to really begin at the beginning and follow those first 28 years. As Benjamin Thomas said, New Salem was when Lincoln went to college and where he learned so much, and yet it's skipped over. And so,
that's what the Jesuits say, that give me the child and I have the man.
Absolutely. And as I say in the opening chapters, it's those first few years in which the child's psyche is imprinted and so important to the development of the child. So if he's raised in an atmosphere where the father is shiftless and lazy and doesn't like his son and has a very difficult relationship with him, you would think that would have an effect on Lincoln and how he develops. And there are a few authors today that claim that a very bad or dysfunctional relationship between Lincoln and his father had a great deal to do with how Lincoln evolved in some of his thoughts.
Well, we're going to get into him in a moment. There's one question I had though about, do I have a misconception? Because you state there are approximately 18,000 books on Lincoln, second only to Jesus. And I always felt Jesus is in a different ballpark entirely, religion. But among mortals, I always thought Napoleon was first, mainly because he touched so many countries and they're all so happy to get rid of him that they wrote reams on him, you know. But I've always thought Napoleon was the first among the mortals, and then Lincoln was after that. Is that a misconception on my part?
I think so. I think Napoleon was first at one time, but I think Lincoln has passed him. And you know better than anyone the number of Lincoln books that keep coming out. I mean, I pointed out, the 2 years leading up to the bicentennial, for instance, there were 108 new books that came out. Now that's more than one book a week for 2 years. Yeah. And if you're doing book reviews, it's almost impossible to keep up with the Lincoln books that are coming out. So that figure that you quoted, 18,000, I think is a little high. I think Frank Williams, who's doing the bibliographic study, is now around 17,000. But it's not just books, of course. It's journal articles, magazine articles too.
Well, that will make it much larger, actually, with magazine articles as well.
Yes, yes. But there's no doubt, of course, what you're pointing out is that this fella has written a great deal about that from every possible angle.
Now I'm very happy that Ralph Newman did not name this the Bonaparte bookshop, Napoleon Bonaparte bookshop. Yeah. So Avis to Lincoln. Let me ask you, now let's get into Thomas. In no particular order, really. Lincoln called himself a slave. He was a slave to his father. And you claim, of course, that he was just being jocular, but he was a slave because he had to give his wages to Lincoln. He felt like that. Maybe he was being jocular, is what you say. But of course, Thomas had 14 mouths to feed and clothe and house. So if he said that, was he being an ungrateful son, basically? Weren't all sons doing that in a family to help the household?
Well, I would certainly think so. I, as a son, did that from the age of 13 to 18, turned over every cent I made to my father. And I can tell you, I didn't hate him. I didn't even resent him for that. And that quote is taken out of context. And that's what bothers me. That's part of the frustration I've had that's motivated me to write this book. If you look at the whole quote, where they say, Lincoln says, I was a slave, and this is what turned him against slavery. Well, he's really giving a speech during the debates in which he says, there is my good friend John Roll. He used to be a slave, and now he's free. And I used to be a slave too, and now I am free, and they let me practice law. Now that seems more jocular to me than it seems to be a very serious condemnation of his father in his early life. I mean, some authors say he was rented out and then had to turn all his wages over to his father. Well, that's more of a reflection on the author than it is on Lincoln, because many of us were rented out as kids and turned money over to our fathers to help out. I'm
just interrupting because it brings up a larger question. You use the term in here, the Warren School.
Yes.
Lewis Warren School versus the Michael Burlingame School, which yes. I think you're putting these two in schools. And please tell us what you mean by those two schools and the import that they have today.
Well, they're opposite, of course. Warren is very favorable in almost every aspect of Abraham Lincoln, whereas Michael Burlingame has delved much more deeply into Lincoln's psychology. And a fair amount of it turns out to be negative, such as I was a slave. his marriage was made in hell. Whereas Warren, of course, is very positive about Lincoln. So much so that Warren spent a good deal of time trying to legitimize the birth of Nancy Hanks. Because in Warren's day, illegitimate children were viewed very negatively. They were considered to be defective, and even to have defective genes because they were conceived in sin. And Warren spent a good deal of time trying to recover Nancy Hanks and legitimize her, whereas Burlingame doesn't pull any punches on that. So the Burlingame school, I think, can be characterized in certain areas as negative, whereas Warren is quite positive. And Warren is not to be underestimated. This man lived in the area and he spent his life in the courthouses. And he uncovered untold documents pertaining to the early Lincolns. And unfortunately, I think he no longer is a source, which I find very unfortunate. And as William Barton, who is of the same period as Warren, and he also spent a great deal of time in courthouses locating documents pertaining to Thomas Lincoln and to the relationship between them. So that's the difference. One is a more negative school and the other is more positive. The one, however, Warren School, I think, has faded far into the background. You won't see him in the bibliographies of many Lincoln books today.
So you think Lincoln Parentage and Childhood that he wrote is still a valuable book?
Very much so. The most valuable of all is, I have a copy here, as a matter of fact. If you can see it, the Lincoln Kinsman. Now, he
Hard
published
to get.
56 pamphlets pertaining to every aspect of Abraham Lincoln, his family, his relatives, including a lot of documentation that he pulled out of courthouses. And it's unfortunate that that Lincoln Kinsman, again, like Warren, you will not find in modern biographies or books on Lincoln. And I think it's a very critical source.
Now, Lincoln did excoriate his father in certain ways by saying, for instance, he could only sign his name in a bungling manner.
Yes.
Yet he was a landowner of some means with that way. And also, of course, he could use his hands more than just signing a name. Dick Hart's wonderful book on the cabinetry that Thomas produced, and some of it is really quite remarkably done and very nice. So he had to have been more than bungling his name.
Very much so. Here you see, I think this cabinet is at Lincoln Memorial University, this corner cabinet. There are 12 wonderful examples of his cabinet work. I think 10 of them are in museums, 2 of them in private homes. And he was an extremely accomplished cabinet maker. And yet he is represented in the recent biographies. I mean, the one quote is that he was sort of a bungling cabinet maker who could do little more than hang windows and doors. Well, look at this. You're seeing examples here of his work. And it is my opinion that he actually made more money or brought more money into the family through his cabinet work than through farming. Although, when he lived in Hardin County, the major mercantile store there was Bleakley and Montgomery. And if you look at their records, you will find that Thomas Lincoln had credits at that store that ranged anywhere from £3 to £30, which translates to about $120, a very substantial amount of money. So this man was not slothful or financially in difficult situation. He owned 9 properties, according to my calculations. 6 of them he paid cash for. They were not mortgaged. And one of them he squatted, and the other two were mortgaged. But I mean, to pay cash for the first 6 properties that he owned, at one time he owned 3 properties when he was 31 years old that totaled $700 in cash and represented about 580 acres of land. The Mill Creek Farm, the 2 lots in Elizabethtown, and the Birthplace Farm, the Sinking Spring Farm. And that certainly reflects a financially solvent man.
You write in here how he lost some of this land through deeds, faulty deeds, and then moved to Indiana. And in the courts, he got money back, but never got that money because he was in Indiana. Why didn't he just go back to pick up the money? He went back to get a wife.
Well, I don't know. There's absolutely nothing that has been left to explain that. My only assumption is he was well established and he was doing quite well, and he just wasn't going to pick up and go back to Elizabethtown to collect his money. And not only that, he probably would have had a very difficult time collecting it. You know, when you won lawsuits in those days, you didn't always get the money that you were due. You had to fight for it and go back into court multiple times. And I'm sure he had it, particularly since he lost all that property in Kentucky, those farms, through faulty titles, through no fault of his own. And as did dozens and dozens of other people. As a matter of fact, it was a 10,000 acre tract that belonged to this merchant in Philadelphia and his family. And so there were probably a few dozen people that lost their land through faulty title.
I once had this wonderful piece of paper, this is a Xerox of a scan of it, that was a part of Lincoln's youthful copybook. And you can see what he did. Practicing his handwriting, he wrote over and over, Thomas Lincoln, Thomas Lincoln, Thomas Lincoln. And I always wondered why, if he disdained him that much, why did he write out his name so often in trying out his handwriting, use his father? Now, of course, we know of that painful talk that writing that he said that now he didn't go to the deathbed because it would be more painful than not. We're never going to know what that father-son dynamic was without having at least one of them on the couch, and we don't. But I'd like you to comment on that relationship, and do we see Thomas because of Abraham? Is that how we look at him today?
Well, I don't think Abraham aspired to be his father and didn't use his father in any way as a role model. But that doesn't mean that he disliked his father or hated his father or didn't want to have anything to do with his father. He certainly interacted with him. You know, and at one auction, his father bought a toy wagon for Abraham, which is something, you know, that a father who abuses or disdains his son wouldn't do. As far as you're referring to the letter that he wrote to John D. Dodgson when Thomas Lincoln was abed dying in 1851, and that's been analyzed a great deal, but always negatively, because Lincoln says, as you mentioned, would it not be more painful for us at this time? And as Richard Hart, I think, has eloquently explained, that letter would be more painful to Sarah Bush Johnson Lincoln, his stepmother, than it would be to Thomas. And after Thomas died, the fact that he didn't go to his funeral, I mean, Thomas is dead, he doesn't know, that would be painful to his stepmother. But then again, as I point out, Mary and Lincoln did not attend the funeral of her father when he died. And as to not putting a tombstone on his father's grave, he never put a tombstone on his mother, Nancy Hanks's grave, who he dearly loved. So I think these things mean less to Lincoln than they mean to some of us. They're more the trappings of of an emotion that he didn't share with others. And don't forget, he named his fourth son Thomas.
That's right.
After his father.
That's right.
So that has to be taken into account.
That's right. There's so much more to go to, but here I am dwelling on Thomas, but he's gotten in the neck so much, and I think that's been wrong. One of the things that has been said about him is that because he went on slave patrols in Kentucky, that he was not against slavery. He went out to help catch runaway slaves at night. But I believe all males in these counties had to take a night, a month, or whatever it was, to be on slave patrol. It was the law. So I don't think it was something that is because he wanted to catch slaves. He probably didn't feel good about it. Lincoln, after all, didn't like slavery. We all know that. Yet he once defended a slave owner.
Correct.
So, that puts him akin with his father a bit.
It is a complicated culture, and the difficulty is what we, Dan, refer to as presentism. It's extremely difficult, as a historian, to put people back in the time. And, this is part of the problem today with attacking statues of various individuals. I mean, we're judging them by present day standards, which of course is totally unfair. We've got to put them in what some people call proper context. They're not just explaining what that proper context is, but you and I know that is presentism. You've got to be able to put yourself back in that period of time. And certainly Thomas Lincoln's role as a sheriff, and if he ever did go on a slave patrol, which I don't think there's any evidence for, but it's not unlikely that he might have. He certainly was anti-slavery, completely anti-slavery. It was part of his religion, and it's just totally unfair to sort of characterize him as a slave capturer. I can tell you offhand that Dr. Samuel Mudd was definitely on a paddy roller patrol that went out and caught slaves.
Yeah.
But he enjoyed doing it.
Yeah. And it doesn't surprise us at all.
No, it doesn't. No.
Well, since we're in the early period, let's get to Anne Rutledge. And I'm going to show you a 1910 publication, a lecture that Billy Herndon gave on Lincoln and Anne Rutledge and other aspects of New Salem. And you write in the book how the originator of the romance story was probably John Hill, who was in New Salem. What weight can we put on John Hill's testimony to that romance? First of all, knowing that he was a Stephen Douglas man and not in love with Lincoln and maybe wanted to harm him. And also Herndon here pushing it. He didn't especially care for Mary Lincoln. And so he may have pushed that to spite Mary. So does Stephen Douglas and Mary Lincoln have a part in producing the romance story of Anne and Abraham?
Well, it's really interesting. And in my opinion, John Hill is the key. And the reason is because John Hill wrote a very, very extensive article on the romance of Lincoln and Anne Rutledge in 1862, while Lincoln was alive in the White House. Herndon did not do his research and give his speech exposing this alleged romance, until 1866. So the fact that John Hill wrote about this in 1862 while Lincoln was alive is something that Jay Monahan said future biographers of Lincoln are going to have to deal with this and answer it, and not a single one of them has. So if we back up a little, the story doesn't emerge publicly until William Herndon gives his lecture. And it is not accepted very well because Mary Lincoln is alive. And this is, as some people said, it's a dagger stuck in her heart to bring up this love affair and romance and to say that Lincoln never loved another woman again. And so Herndon learned this story by interviewing 24 people who knew Lincoln at one time or another in New Salem. Whereas John Hill published in 1862, and it convinced me. It convinced me it must be real, because he's not influenced by Herndon. He's not influenced by anyone else except his mother and father, Samuel Hill and Parthena Hill, who lived in New Salem. Sam Hill proposed to Anne Rutledge. She turned him down. But then McNamara proposed, she accepted. Now Hill and McNamara owned the store together. And I think this is what broke up the partnership. Sam Hill bought out McNamara, who was very upset by the fact that she turned him down, but accepted Sam Hill's proposal. At any rate, this to me is one of the most wonderful stories. Well, it certainly, as you know, is very romantic. It's very Shakespearean, this love affair, which is tragically terminated by her untimely death in 1835. But here's why I got into it. I looked at 26 historians who we all know, who are eminent Lincoln historians, and I did not manipulate this. When I looked at it, 13 of them were on yay-sayers. They said, yes, there was a love affair and engagement. And 13 said, no, it's a total myth. And on both sides of that ledger are very prominent historians. The yay-sayers include John Y. Simon, Lloyd Lewis, Michael Burlingame, Nelson Richard Kern. And we recognize those as excellent historians. On the other side is James G. Randall, Paul Angle, Mark Neely, Stephen Oates. So I said, how can 26 prominent Lincoln historians look at exactly the same data and come to opposite conclusions? The yay-sayers have no information that the naysayers don't have, and the naysayers have no information the yay-sayers have. Both sides have exactly the same information, the same interviews, and yet they come down on opposite sides. So that's why I jumped into it. I wanted to know how in the world they could break out like this, evenly on both sides of the story. Besides, as you well know, this is a story that the public is captivated by. Carl Sandburg really brought this to the American people as a great love story, and it's very Shakespearean. You know, she dies a tragic death at a very young age.
Bjorn, could you quickly put up that oil painting that we showed, that fantasy of Lincoln and Anne Rutledge? This was done by Frederick Courter, Courter, at the beginning of the 20th century. It's a 7-foot painting. And on a book buying trip, I walked into a home and there it was standing right in front of me. It was amazing. And this fantasy, probably one of Courter's, the daughter of a neighbor came in and took the place of Anne. And I just thought this is a wonderful piece, and making Lincoln younger as well. But this is a Frederick Courter piece that's not really seen very often. So thank you, Bjorn, for showing that.
Well, he certainly was impressed with the legend, wasn't he?
Well, he wanted to sell a painting, and 13 out of 50% of the people believe it's true. So 50% might buy it.
Yes, yes.
Bjorn, what do you have?
Yeah, well, this is our program today is very popular with our regulars, and they're joining us today and they're chiming in. So I thought I would do some shout outs and then also maybe pitch a couple of questions for Ed that come from our customers. First of all, I want to shout out to a few of the people who are watching. Dennis Meyer Pastor is here. Dave from Gurnee, Illinois. Steve and Rita from Madison, Georgia are watching. Dan Madsen, a regular friend of ours. Thank you, Dan. It's always good to see you. Matt Knofsinger from here in Chicago, or north of Chicago, is here. And we should be very honored to have another fine Lincoln scholar watching us right now. Catherine Canavan is watching from Wilmington, Delaware. Matt Gordon is here. Jimmy Johnson from Alabama. Sam Black from Dayton, Bob Willard. And I am going to jump right in and give you a question, Ed, this is Matt Gordon's question. Matt wants to know, did Thomas Lincoln ever meet any of his grandchildren? Did Robert Lincoln ever comment on his grandparents on either side? Thank you, Matt.
No. But
great question. So yeah, Thomas never did.
Simple answer, but look, again, presentism, the culture of the day, okay, the separation in distance and time and travel and what have you. Now, when the Lincolns moved to Indiana, they did stop by the farm at the Mill Creek farm of Lincoln's sister and brother-in-law, where at the time Lincoln's grandmother was still living and alive. So we believe, of course, they stayed and met with Bathsheba Lincoln, his grandmother, and Lincoln at this time is about 12 years old, 11 years old. So that to me is the only time that generations met that I'm aware of.
Okay. Also, Samuel Black from Dayton. He wants to. He knows where you stand, Ed, on as a scholar of the Lincoln Assassination. So Sam wants to jump right into that topic, and he asks, "What do you think Booth said on April 11th under the White House window?"
Well, I think that where he said, it's been written where he said that means end citizenship. That's the last speech he'll ever give. Now I will put him through. There's no evidence that he ever said that means end word citizenship. That comes from a novel written by George Alfred Townsend. But we do know he was there, and we do know, according to Lewis Powell, who was with him, said that that is the last speech he will ever make. Now I will put him through. And of course, he's referring to the fact that Lincoln advocated suffrage or voting for certain Blacks, namely, as he said, the more intelligent and those who certainly served in the Union Army, which is nearly 200,000 Blacks. And that was pretty bold for him to say at the time. And that's what stimulated Booth. And in my opinion, it was a hate crime.
Yeah. All right. And then, fellas, I'm going to maybe bring you a few more questions later in the program, but I'm also going to give you a few comments here before I duck out and let the two of you have the conversation back, because some of our friends are giving some good comments, even though they're not actually questions for Ed. But Dennis says, I love the Sinking Springs site in Kentucky, but it must have been a hardscrabble existence. Also, Matt Gordon has an opinion about Napoleon and Lincoln. Napoleon was a conqueror. Lincoln was a conciliator. And then Bob Willard is watching us from California. Hello, Bob.
Hello, Bob.
And Bob wants to comment on something that you commented a few minutes ago, Ed. He said, I just received Dick Hart's brand new 300-page Thomas Lincoln Reconsidered, which blows out of the water the negative characterizations of the Lincoln father-son relationship. So there's a pretty decisive comment there from Bob Willard. And then also Dave says, I think Thomas became a convenient villain against which biographers could compare Lincoln. Every good story needs a villain.
Well, yes. So I would say, let me ask a question. Why is Thomas Lincoln the villain in this story? And why, Herndon said that Lincoln was raised in a stagnant, putrid pool. And everyone else has picked up on Herndon. Even to this day, biographers do that. So presumably it is to contrast Lincoln with his upbringing. And the more you can degrade his upbringing and those around him, the more miraculous Lincoln's rise to the presidency seems. And it's one of the reasons I wrote the book. It just seems unfair to me that you have to denigrate Lincoln's early life and those around him, and especially his father, so that you can elevate the stature that he rose to when he became president. It's totally unnecessary. And Thomas Lincoln is a part of Abraham Lincoln, and he's a part of who Abraham Lincoln became.
Absolutely. Hey guys, I'm going to jump back out, and I might have a couple questions before we end it, but please continue this fascinating conversation. I'm having fun watching.
You know, we may even have to, and all of our listeners, we may even have to go a little bit over if Ed doesn't mind, because there is so much to go into. But we're going to leave some of it to you people. Buy the book and read it. 193 pages, and it's great reading, and you will swear, you'll be happy, you'll exult, you'll have all sorts of feelings, whether for or against. But I think it's useful to have this book in your brain. Now, I want to go to something because it's it's a hot topic today, and that is Lincoln and the Indians. And I've shown this before. And here's an 1863 print of Lincoln receiving Comanche Indians. This was done in Paris, and it's in the East Room of the White House, and receiving this delegation of Indians. And of course, the French were very interested in Indians. The whole continent was, of the Native Americans. That's why Lincoln is smaller than the Indians, who are central to this. He gave a little talk here, and I want to just read a short piece of that, very short. One of the things he said: the pale-faced people are numerous and prosperous because they cultivate the earth, produce bread, and depend upon the products of earth rather than wild game for subsistence, as if the Indians cared about prosperity. He then went on, this is the chief reason of the difference. But there is another. Although we are now engaged in a great war between one another, we are not, as a race, so much disposed to fight and kill one another as our red brethren. I guess Lincoln forgot the Crusades, the 100 Years' War, War of 1812. I could go on and take the rest of the time reading out wars that the white race was in. But he was a 19th century man. And, he, as you point out in this book, and why some want to take down his statues today, is because of his relationship with the Indians, mainly executing 38, although he pardoned hundreds more. And he went over every one of them to make sure he wasn't doing anything wrong. Now, each side certainly had its own conduct of war. That even happened with the French much earlier. With the interactions of the Indians, they were talking past each other, actually, and I think it was happening then with Lincoln time too. So how can one side execute members of the other side who did not know or understand the white man's conduct of war?
Well, because they won. And as you well know, Napoleon said it's the victors who write history. But it's a very interesting case. I mean, at one time, Lincoln was praised for doing what he did in the Dakota Wars, and now he's being condemned for it. And if I can briefly summarize, this war broke out in August of 1862. It lasted through September, and it was finally put down when Union troops were sent to the border to put them down. But it was a very large war. There were between 800 and 1,000 settlers that were killed, women and children, along with the men. And this was the basis for the trial. 1,500 of the Dakota Sioux were taken into captivity at the end of the war, and 400 men were called out to be tried for various atrocities. And there are records of extreme atrocities that were committed, but basically it is the killing of women and children, non-combatants, and all laws of war exempt non-combatants, women and children. It's pointed out that Indian culture did not differentiate. When they fought a war, they considered all of the enemy to be legitimate targets, including women and children. But the United States, and remember, the Dakota Sioux are a sovereign nation because we signed treaties with them, and they are expected to abide by the laws of war, and that women and children are out of bounds. And so the 400 that were tried on the basis of what were considered violations of the laws of war, killing women and children and committing rape. Of the 400, and it's very interesting, 97 were acquitted. And they were tried by military tribunal. And the critics say that this military tribunal is an illegal kangaroo court. And my answer to that is, why didn't they then just convict all 400? Why did they find 97 of the warriors innocent and dismiss it? So they found 303 guilty and sentenced them to hang. Now, Lincoln had a rule throughout the war that any death sentence was to be reviewed by him before carried out. That pertained, of course, to the Union Army, and Lincoln reviewed every single case of a death sentence before it was carried out. The military also had another very interesting rule, and that was every single military tribunal was to be recorded verbatim by shorthand, a form of shorthand then that existed at the time known as Pittman shorthand. And so we have the verbatim trials, not only of Union Army, but of these 303 Dakota Sioux. So Lincoln stayed the executions, told Pope, who was in charge of the military tribunal, General Pope, to send the records to him. And Lincoln sat down with his Judge Advocate General, Joseph Holt, and reviewed all 303 of the trials and convictions. And in the end, he overturned 265, but he approved 38 because it involved, in his mind, rape and atrocities against women and children. That today has backfired. There is now a memorial park in Mankato, Minnesota, known as Memorial Park, Remembrance Park. And there is a scroll in that park listing the names of the 38 Sioux that were hanged. And every December 26th, the Dakota Sioux hold a memorial ride to honor the 38 that were hanged. And so, I mean, I could go on at great length. The students at the University of Wisconsin have now demanded that the Adolph Weinman statue of Lincoln in front of the administration building be removed because Lincoln caused pain and decimation to Native Americans. Perhaps you know or don't know that the San Francisco School Board voted 6-1 to remove Abraham Lincoln's name from schools in the San Francisco School District, along with 4 others, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Paul Revere, and I forget the 4th. But in Lincoln's case, the board specifically said because Lincoln caused pain and decimated the Dakota Sioux in approving the hanging of those 38 Indians. So
That's been put on hold, hasn't it?
What's
The
that?
changing of the names? Has that been put on hold in San
Not to
Francisco?
my knowledge, it hasn't been put on hold.
I thought it was, but
It may well be. It may well be, as the removal of the statue has been put on hold. Now, the Thomas Ball statue that we know, Emancipation, has been removed from Boston in the city park, and it is under consideration in Washington, the original Thomas Ball statue, which still stands. Eleanor Holmes Norton, who is the delegate, DC delegate to the House of Representatives, she's a non-voting delegate. She's introduced a bill to remove the statue because, in her words, it is demeaning and degrading because it depicts a nearly naked slave kneeling at Lincoln's feet. They feel it would be better if he were in an upright or standing position. Well, they seem to miss the whole point of the sculptor. He used the famous emblem developed by Josiah Wedgwood that the Abolition Society adopted of a kneeling slave in chains with making the statement or motto, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And so the sculptor Thomas Ball used that image of abolition, the Abolition Society, in the Statue of Emancipation. So I don't know what the outcome is going to be. The reason the bill has been introduced into the House is because that statue is under the National Park Service. It's not under the city of Washington. So it will take congressional approval to remove it. I doubt that that will happen, but the controversy will continue.
Well, there's a chapter in your book, and it's fascinating. I think everyone needs to read that, especially those who have not read it, like San Francisco, so in Minnesota. Another topic you have in here is Lincoln's anger. And that's something not well known, even in Lincoln circles, I think, the anger of Lincoln sometimes. You quote Nathaniel Branson's letter to Herndon. He was in New Salem and said Lincoln was never angry. And of course, all of us, I think, were surprised when we saw in Spielberg's film, Lincoln smack Robert across the face. And that was very surprising to us and shocked us. And in your book, by the way, you have the image that Lloyd Ostendorf did that comes from the Peoria speech, the lost speech. And I'm not sure, I'll ask you, I'm not sure it's anger as much as passion, but talk to us about Lincoln's anger. And so those of us who don't know, those who don't know Lincoln, some of us who do, are a little bit surprised at the amount of anger you find.
Well, Lincoln's anger is so rare that it's noteworthy. We wouldn't talk about it otherwise. And there were moments where he showed anger, but in virtually every case, it's where he is being misquoted. And he gets initially upset by the fact that he's being misquoted, and he eventually, in several instances, shows a great deal of anger. I don't know if this image by Lloyd Ostendorf is that accurate or not. I mean, that really shows rage. But Lincoln did on occasion show anger, and I feel when quite justified, but it's so rare that we talk about it. I mean, Lincoln was certainly one of the most even-keeled, compassionate individuals. His famous quote is that, "I destroy my enemies when I make them my friends." And he more often than not is conciliatory in every instance, in every engagement that he has. I mean, my goodness. Dan, an old friend of mine once said to me, "If you really get involved with Abraham Lincoln, it's going to change your life." And it surely changed my life, and it surely changed your life. And I've seen it again and again.
Most of us watching the same thing.
Absolutely. And there's a reason for that, because this man represents everything I want to be and try to be and sometimes fail and can't be. But he's the model. He's the other thing I love is, when he was asked, "Mr. Lincoln, what is your religion?" And he said, "When I do good, I feel good. And when I do bad, I feel bad. That is my religion." Well, I think that sums it up, and it sums him up to a T. So yes, there were moments of anger, but they're justified in every case where he's being misquoted, being made to look like the fool. And occasionally he responds sharply. I don't think in rage, but quite pointedly and sharply.
It was worthwhile chapter, and I was glad to have it in there and read it. Thank you for that. All right, misconception. The Bixby letter. I'd like to get more into an elevator talk on it because it's such a big topic. But here is William Barton with his book, A Beautiful Blunder, The True Story. That was produced, what year was this? In 1926.
Yes.
William Barton wrote The Beautiful Blunder. And you certainly in your book dissect Mr. Burlingame, a friend of all of ours, on that subject. But you still claim it's unsettled. It's an unsettled question, and Burlingame does have merit. And you talk at length, and don't go into length on this, about n-gram tracing of words and verbiage and probability analysis. It's a fascinating read for anyone who's listening. That's an amazing chapter to listen to. So what is the misconception of the matters if it's still open for such debate? And in fact, I'm showing here the Atlantic. This was Atlantic Monthly, the love letters of Abraham Lincoln and Anne Rutledge that came out back in 1928. You have the actual Atlantic Monthly. This was a poster for it. This was the minor affair that Paul Engel put to rest.
Yes.
So it's been a big issue for many years. Briefly, the Bixby letter.
Well, I think
Who wrote
this is the scientist in me coming out, because there's data. Michael Burlingame presents data, and so that's susceptible to being analyzed and attacked. And my feeling is that, well, let me back up. If we go back many years, there are individuals who said John Hay told them that he had written the Bixby letter. But when you look at it, it's C told B, told A, told Hay. So it's not only hearsay, it's hearsay several people removed. Hay himself never said it, at least to anyone's knowledge. And so Michael Burlingame picked up on this when he discovered in John Hay's scrapbook, which is filled with John Hay's writings and poems and what have you, the Bixby letter, clipped from a newspaper and pasted in. So Michael rightly was puzzled. He said, what is that doing in a scrapbook of John Hay's? And then he looked at a few other things, such as he claimed that Lincoln only used the word beguile once, and it's in the Bixby letter, whereas John Hay used the word many times. And that was a piece of evidence. Well, it turns out that while they both use the word beguile, it has two different meanings, as you well know. In the one case, it means to deceive or to mislead. In the other case, it means to charm or entice. And Hay uses it in that second meaning, whereas Lincoln uses it in the first. But I found out then that there are several other words that Lincoln only ever used once in his speeches and writings. Disenthrall is a word. Abideth, aberration. Lincoln only ever used those once. And so I think that sort of weakens Michael's argument that beguile, being only used once by Lincoln, favors Hay. But in addition to that, there are two individuals that actually commented directly on this. Robert Lincoln himself was interested in the Bixby letter, not who wrote it, but what happened to it, because as you know, it disappeared. It doesn't exist. We think Mrs. Bixby destroyed it. She was an ardent Confederate. She was not pleased by the letter, presumably. That's a speculation. But nonetheless, Robert Lincoln writes a letter to Isaac Martin asking him what he knows about possibly what happened to the Bixby letter. And in the course of that exchange, Robert Lincoln writes, and I think I can pretty much quote, your suggestion that neither Nicolay nor Hay knew of the Bixby letter is correct. Hay himself told me so. So either Hay is lying, which no one believes because he was certainly an honorable man, a very well-accomplished man. And the second one is Hay himself writes a letter to William Chandler, who at the time was chairman of the Spanish Claims Committee following the Spanish-American War. And in that letter, Hay says, the letter by Mr. Lincoln to Mrs. Bixby is genuine. It is included in our edition. So I think this very much weakens Michael's argument. Then we come to engram tracing. And this is what caught my attention because it's scientific. This is a computer analysis of writing to determine attribution. And you look at the sequence of words or letters or phrases that appear. And then you look at a large corpus of the suspected individual's writings, and you come up with a probability. And the computer runs this, looks at sequence of words. And the group in Birmingham, England did this and came up with the conclusion that Hay wrote the letter. And of course, that to me would have answered the question. Michael Burlingame himself said this proves that Hay wrote it. So I did not know what engram tracing was, and I dove into it and learned what it was. It's very much like this game you see on TV, chain reaction. It's what word follows another word. For instance, the word San is most often followed by Diego or Francisco than it is by dog or cow. So it's a probability analysis. Well, along came another group in Nuremberg, Germany, who did the same thing and said that engram analysis only works on documents of over 1,000 words. Well, the Bixby letter is only 139, and they concluded that you simply cannot apply this type of analysis to such short documents. So they concluded that in private correspondence with me, that the evidence does not show that Hay wrote the Bixby letter. And so my point is this: my hero is Carl Sagan, who said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So before you're going to say that Hay wrote the Bixby letter, which is certainly a treasure and ranks among the 4 top writings of Lincoln, in my opinion, you need extraordinary evidence. And I just don't think Michael has come up with it.
Yeah.
Anyway, I go into detail in the book.
Yeah, it's amazing, and it's really worth that chapter alone. Every chapter is worth reading.
It's a hot topic. It's a hot topic.
Positively.
And of course,
just a quick thing here, because you have a chapter on West Virginia, and you call it the illegitimate child. Read the book to find out why it's called illegitimate child. But I'm wondering, should Biden be unhappy that Lincoln helped create West Virginia now that its senior senator is the power in the Senate? I'm just wondering if he should be unhappy with Mr.
He's
Lincoln.
unhappy, and he has to think about it. Senator Manchin is at the moment a thorn in Biden's programs, and he's going to have to come to terms with it. But little old West Virginia, with our few electoral votes, we're nobody, and nobody pays attention to us until now.
It's a fascinating chapter. We haven't gotten to the reluctant emancipator chapter, which is something that I think people would want to read and be good ammunition. Trading with the enemy, which most of us had not known about until we saw Mitchell's book, Lincoln's Lies. Actually, we had a brief discussion there, but trading with the enemy is fascinating, and mainly because many of his friends gained wealth, or some of his friends gained wealth.
Considerable wealth.
Yeah.
Considerable wealth.
And of course, Marfan's disease, which has been a topic for God knows how long. And you talk about Marfan's in detail in here. And from your perspective, it's well worth having. So before we get to Bjorn, I'd like to talk about what we have coming up on the next House Divided interviews. The next 2, each will be on the day of release, just like this book today. If you want to get a limited edition, more or less, and the day of release book plate in it, everyone who's watching right now, go order it. You won't be unhappy getting this book. We didn't even talk about David Donald's use of the phrase "getting right with Lincoln." But nonetheless, on Tuesday, May 4th at 3:30 p.m. Central Time, We have Ron White, Lincoln in Private, what his most personal reflections tell us about our greatest president. Ron's looking at Lincoln's best thoughts, as Lincoln called them, in the short notes he wrote to himself and kept in his drawer and were found later. So that's Ron White, Lincoln in Private, Tuesday, May 4th. And then a month later, on June 1st, another Tuesday at 3:30 p.m. Central Time, we'll have Michael Burlingame again on the release date for his book, An American Marriage, the untold story of Abraham and Mary Todd. And Michael takes a look at the relationship between Abraham and Mary Lincoln. And that's one you're also going to want to tune into and get a release date book with his signed book plate. I just want to say that tomorrow is a special day in Lincoln World, April 14th. And we're going to have a special book list. Our monthly book list for April is coming out tomorrow. We'll put it onto our website. And it's going to have an emphasis, of course, on the assassination. So I hope you'll all look at that when we post it tomorrow. Ed, thank you so much. I'm going to let her off to Bjorn now.
Oh, I'm so delighted. I thank you so much for having me on, Dan. I just wish I could be there in person. Your shop is a museum.
Next time, next book.
Soon. Hey, everybody, I want to give a few shout outs. We're not going to have time to really ask any questions here. Probably not, but we have had a lot of shout outs since that last time I was in here talking to you. And most of them, Ed and Dan, were questions and comments about the removal of statues, about the removal of memorials. And we're not going to talk anymore about that, except to say that if it's moving you, then that means that it's important. We need to be thinking about this. We need to be talking about this topic right now. And if we had an entire hour, Ed would probably have plenty to say about Lincoln statues. However, just yesterday, I had Karen Cox on this program with her new book, No Common Ground, Confederate Monuments and the Ongoing Fight for Racial Justice. Now, Karen is only interested in Confederate monuments. Today, we all talked about Lincoln monuments almost exclusively. But if you want a history book, not an angry shouting thing, but a history book about the history of the Confederate monuments and what led us to where we are now, I do recommend Karen Cox, No Common Ground, which is available on our website, right where Ed's book can be ordered too. So if you get Ed's book, you might also want to get Karen's book. Now, we do have one other question, and I don't know whether you want to spend any time on it, Ed, but I'm going to tell you. But Doug Krozik from Kentucky asks, are you familiar with Bostic, North Carolina's claim that Lincoln was born at nearby Puzzle Creek? The Bostic Historical Center has erected a stone marker commemorating Lincoln's birth in North Carolina.
I'm very much familiar with it, and I've written extensively on it. And as a result of the congressman from that particular district in North Carolina wanted to know what the facts were before he either endorsed that or rejected it. Yes, it's a wonderful story. You know, there are 8 fathers of Abraham Lincoln, including Patrick Henry, and 2 Abraham Enlows, one of them from that district in North Carolina. Mm-hmm. So it's never ending. The pot keeps boiling, and we keep having a lot of fun with it, don't we?
So the last controversy of this program was about putting up a monument, not taking.
Yes.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today. And I want to thank everybody out there for joining us for A House Divided. And we will see you next time.